Okay, so what if I told you that control of a nation's most critical industries, we're talking telecommunications, power, the whole shebang, all came down to how you defined a single word? Well, today we're diving into a landmark Supreme Court case that did exactly that, and the consequences were worth billions. The big question at the heart of it all, what does capital really mean?
This whole legal firestorm kicked off with a puzzle, a real head-scratcher that gets to the very core of a country's economic independence. It's this paradox about who's actually in charge of a company, and it was something the Supreme Court found, well, let's just say it was deeply worrying.
I want you to just imagine this for a second. A company where someone owns just 1% of the stock, but has 100% of the control. I mean, it sounds crazy, right? Like some kind of corporate magic trick. But this is the exact mind-bending question the Supreme Court had to answer. And believe me, their answer changed everything.
This chart right here, this visualizes the problem perfectly. You could literally have a situation where Filipinos own 99.9% of a company's shares, almost all of the economic value, but foreigners could hold 100% of the actual control. So you're probably asking, how is that even possible? Well, it all boils down to the kind of shares we're talking about.
And listen, this wasn't just some abstract theory. The court laid it out plain and simple. You could set up a company with tons and tons of non-voting shares for Filipinos and just a tiny, tiny handful of super powerful voting shares for foreigners. And what's the result? The foreigners, with basically a sliver of the actual equity, could elect the entire board and call all the shots. The court's own words for this? Obviously absurd. A total end run around what the Constitution was trying to do.
So what was the Constitution trying to do? To really get where the court was coming from, we've got to rewind and look at the fundamental law of the land, specifically at a rule designed to protect the national interest. And here it is. This is the famous 60-40 rule, and it's a huge deal in Philippine economic policy. It applies to public utilities, industries that are absolutely vital to national security, like telecommunications, power, water. The whole point of the rule is to make sure that the control of these critical assets stays firmly in Filipino hands. And this brings us right back to the billion-dollar question. The entire legal battle, the future of foreign investment in the country, all of it hinged on defining this one single word, capital. Was it one thing or something else entirely? The stakes just could not have been higher. So the court was presented with two totally competing definitions. And depending on which one you picked, you'd get a radically different answer for who gets to sit in the driver's seat of the country's most important companies. All right, so let's break this down. It's actually pretty simple. On one side, you had the traditional view, which said capital means all the shares, voting, non-voting, the whole lot. This is all about total economic ownership. But on the other side was the argument that won the day, that for the Constitution's purpose, capital has to mean the shares that give you actual control, the voting shares. At the end of the day, one view counts the paper, the other counts the power. So, how in the world did the Supreme Court settle this? Well, they didn't just flip a coin. They went on a deep dive, digging through decades of legal history and even the original debates of the people who wrote the Constitution. And what they found was pretty stunning. A clear, consistent pattern for over 40 years, from way back in 1967 with the Investment Incentives Act all the way to the Foreign Investments Act of 1991. The law has always defined a Philippine national based on ownership of voting stock. The historical evidence was just overwhelming. But they didn't stop there. They went back and listened to what the framers of the 1987 Constitution were actually saying during their debates. And boom, there it was. Commissioner Escuna warned about this exact scenario, calling it an anomaly, a situation where foreigners could have all the control despite owning a minority of shares. It was crystal clear. Their number one concern was preventing foreign control, not just counting up all the shares. And the Foreign Investments Act of 1991, which is the main law here, just spells it right out. It couldn't be clearer. To be a Philippine national, a corporation has to have at least 60% of its capital stock outstanding and entitled to vote owned by Filipinos. The law itself ties capital directly to the right to vote. It's right there in black and white. So based on all this, the court laid out a really clear two-part test to make sure control is real. First, the voting control test. Filipinos have to own at least 60% of the shares that can vote. Simple enough. But second, there's the beneficial ownership test. This means they have to have full, genuine ownership of those shares, not just holding them as a front for someone else. Okay, so this wasn't just some academic legal discussion.
The court's final decision had immediate, massive, real-world consequences for one of the biggest corporations in the country and the entire telecommunications industry.
And with that, the hammer came down. The court's verdict was made final. They denied all the motions to reconsider. From that point on, for the purpose of controlling public utilities in the Philippines, capital means voting capital. End of story. The debate was officially over.
And here is why this case was so critical. Get this number, 64.27%. That was the percentage of PLDT's common shares, the shares that actually vote for the board of directors, that were owned by foreigners at the time. This one number tells you everything. Under the old, fuzzy definition, they were fine. But under the court's clarified definition, not so much.
And this ruling wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a command. The Supreme Court ordered the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, to launch an investigation into PLDT to make sure it complied with the Constitution based on this now rock-solid definition of capital as voting control. You know, in the end, the Supreme Court framed its decision not as just some technicality about corporate shares, but as a fundamental question about national identity and economic destiny. And it leaves us with this incredibly powerful thought from the court itself. Is the purpose of the nation's highest law to ensure that Filipinos are masters of their own economy or not? It's a question that echoes long, long after the final verdict came down.